the knock-on effects that you have outlined, although you're outlining the economic crimes as, you know, what is illicit. What happens is developing countries are forced to compete. So they're forced to try and attract in the multinationals, and they're fighting against Ireland, who has been doing it for years. So if you're forced to compete, you may invest in inappropriate infrastructure, the equivalent of our advanced factories that some of you may remember from the 80s. Money goes into things that the multinationals might need instead of going into healthcare and education. You have this power imbalance, the state versus the multinational. The companies are very much more powerful than the countries. The top economies, many of them are companies rather than countries. So there is a severe danger then that as they're negotiating with countries and the countries are cutting them a favourable deal, there is a risk of corruption. There is a risk of the country not being able to make its case. If the country sets up with low corporate tax rates, and the tax rates are being bled from the country to Europe in this kind of royalty pipeline, they need to levy tax somewhere, so they may levy tax disproportionately on individuals. If you have high personal taxes, you will have more tax avoidance. So we had it here in the 80s as well. If the tax rates go up around 60%, people will stop paying. They'll start trying to avoid them, and that's a big problem. You have a lower tax base. You can tend to have a neglect of indigenous enterprise. We've also had that here. Our tax system has been skewed towards multinationals, and we find ourselves with relatively little indigenous industry. You get this geographic inequality, where most of the development is somewhere that suits the multinationals, near the coast, near the port, less in peripheral areas, where you would have indigenous companies, where indigenous companies, you know, equally motivated. You have the transfer pricing risk, whereby money may be moved through this kind of royalty pipeline. You also have trade barriers as the EU strike to, you know, protect themselves from developing countries getting the multinational investment. You have a lot of pressure on the negotiation of treaties. Income can become very unstable, because when a company comes in, it locates, you've got lots of income because people are employed. When they pull out, it becomes very unstable. We've seen that here in Ireland as well. And because of that, we've seen the effect that has had on the Irish aid budget. Because when we had a lot of money, we were saying, well, maybe we won't meet our Millennium Development Goals because 0.7% of what all the multinationals are making is really quite high. And now that we have less money, they're saying, well, obviously we won't meet our development because we've no money. So, you know, this does have that effect. And you have the impact on developing countries generally of this skewing towards intellectual property and generics. You're familiar with the situation of AIDS drugs in South Africa, for example. And the more the tax system, this tax consensus, skews towards privatising intellectual property, the more you're going to get that kind of knock-on. Just to look quite quickly, I'll skim through these. Ireland should look more at small companies, foster enterprise. We need to link in our heads what we're doing with our tax system and what we're doing with our aid. We think of ourselves as being fantastic in the area of overseas aid. It's part of this post-colonial thing. If we have to connect that to what we're doing with our tax system, there's little point in sending over a pittance of overseas aid to a country that you're systematically robbing blind indirectly through your tax system. We need to think long term. Developing countries also need to do that, and they also need, which is a difficult tightrope walk, to try to negotiate with multinationals. Probably can't do that on their own. So what an increasing trend, which is a growing one and a good one, is the development of multilateral tax treaties. So instead of the tax treaty being between the US and Namibia, and the US and South Africa, and the US and Zimbabwe, it may be between the US and all of the SADC. So you get a bunch of countries that operate together and they negotiate a treaty. It gives them a much stronger bargaining power, and that's a very good thing. But beyond that, tax has moved a bit beyond national borders now. Tax is bigger than that. Some people argue that companies should pay no tax anyway. The argument goes that companies are owned by people. Eventually the money will be paid out to shareholders and they can pay the tax. So companies, meanwhile, we shouldn't bother taxing them. It's time consuming and troublesome. The argument is usually made by people who own shares in companies. Because, you know, they've got it. It's like you change the rules halfway through the football match and say, sure, whoever has the ball can just keep the ball for the rest of the match. And that'll be fine. We need more exchange of information between taxing authorities, more UN model treaties. If tax were regarded more as part of corporate social responsibility, that would be a very good thing. We talk about responsible companies and irresponsible companies. We need to focus on how much tax they're paying, which means we need to know how much tax they're paying. So we need to see more country by country reporting. I'm sorry to be rushing now, but I know I'm slightly short of time with it. The outcome of it, I suppose, is foreign direct investment, or FDIs, multinationals coming in. They're fabulous, but they're short term. So they are using you as the country, so by all means use them back. Just don't rely on them being there in 10 or 20 years' time. You've got to try and link these things together. Massa talked about economic crime, as defined by, illicit or prohibited activities. But the bleeding of tax revenue from the developed world into Ireland and the EU is also a crime. 85% unemployment in Liberia is a crime. And that infant mortality rate is a crime. And it's a form of robbery, if you like. Now, Ireland doesn't want to think of itself as participating in that kind of robbery. And we might not be robbing directly ourselves, but it's tax systems like ours that facilitate the bleeding of capital, because we legitimise it and we hide it and we make it opaque and we make it difficult to see. So we might not be actually doing the robbery, but with our tax system we're almost certainly driving the getaway car, which is almost just as bad. So, thank you.
So questions, there's a few. We'll take 3 at a time if that's okay.
Good evening, my name is Clement Silverman. It's the African Center lecture every year brings something absolutely new and fantastic to the intellectual discussion and maybe the local narratives in Ireland about Africa, the challenges it faces, and some of the issues that we, students of Africa, people from Africa, friends of Africa, should consider. While I have some questions, maybe I'll just leave that privately when I probably pose those to Ms. Washington in relation to some of to her presentation. But my own comment really is about the organization and the kind of presentation that we get in this kind of forum, which is very impressive. But only recently, maybe the African Center coordinator might shed more light about this, is that one of the former guest lecturers here recently passed away, sadly, in Kenya, Dr. Tajuddin Abdurrahim, in a car crash. He was a guest lecturer here, I think, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. Maybe Erica will talk more about that. But, I'm really fascinated by this whole new dimension, which we never really talk about in terms of development and in terms of aid and development in Africa. This whole issue of taxes, I'm very taken by the presentation. And maybe my question is really, how can we make this link much more clear in terms of how people think about it, in terms of, because all of us, we're talking about rebuilding the economy and prosperity in Ireland, but at the same time we sort of thump our backs about the amounts we are generously giving in overseas development aid, which is all very legitimate, but how do we make the link that make that money really go far, and not only go far, but have some more legitimacy in terms of where it's coming from and where it is going, because they are really beginning to be serious questions. And maybe the question, I leave this now and just leave the new whole range of dialogue in Africa about the efficacy of aid and assistance, development assistance, as it is presently constituted, in the absence of a genuine effort to actually trade with Africans, to grow businesses, to promote entrepreneurship, to make production really work for Africans and African people. And I know there are a number of new faces on the international scene, especially the Zambian woman from America, I forget her name now, with her new, obviously controversial book in this area about how come aid is not working in Africa. And I don't know whether the panel has some time to sort of share some thoughts on that.